the nature of sexual preference and gender identity and these laws in Canada, and it raises certain questions about the mind. It raises certain questions about sin. It raises certain questions about liberty. Raises certain questions about the soul. I observed to Ben earlier today that there's this question raging on Twitter about, can you be homosexual and conservative? And I think that we're so behind as conservatives, even having that conversation, that we don't know that in the future all homosexuals will have to be conservative, because the transgender ideology has gone so far that you won't be able to be homosexual without being a bigot, and they'll all move over to be conservative. But the best debate raging on the internet over the last 24 hours, I think, was inspired by our very own Matt Walsh, and that's the question of, it started, Matt, if I'm not mistaken, a tweet that you put out that was about the increase in episodes of depression, increase in episodes of anxiety by young people in this country, children in this country, because of these horrible lockdowns that the government has foisted upon us, and that so many of us have willingly embraced and brought into our homes. And someone made the point that mental illness is on the increase because of COVID. And Matt, you responded by saying, well, there are two problems with essentially what you're saying. One is COVID didn't cause any of this. We did through our misguided policies in response to COVID. And two, your position is that you can't call it mental illness when we inflicted it upon children. It wasn't created by their biology. It wasn't created by virus or bacteria, or not even by birth. It was created by our very deliberate action, something that we did to these kids. And therefore, I think what you were implying is that the surest way to address it is to stop doing that to our kids. And from there, you can tell us more, but the internet melted.
Yeah. I mean, I think the point is that for kids who are in despair, or they're anxious, or they're stressed out, or they're sad, especially over the last 2 years, that's not mental illness. They're not diseased. That is a totally justifiable and, in fact, rational response to the position that they've been put in. It's a response to their environment. And so we can look at a kid who's been, he spent 1 year locked away in his house, having to go to school online, taken away from his friends. Then he goes to school, and now he's got to wear a mask, and he doesn't get it. Some kids have gone 2 years not seeing their friends' faces and not being able to show their face. I mean, these kinds of things have a real effect on people's psychology and on their spirit. And so that's a response. Now, it's not a good response. It doesn't mean that we should just, they're depressed and we should just, they got to deal with it. No, but we have to understand the source of the problem, and then there could be counseling, there could be all kinds of ways to address it. But the problem is if we say, well, you got a mental illness, and so we're going to give you some drugs, we're going to give you some counseling, and then throw you right back into the environment that caused it in the first place.
Yeah.
And then that started this whole debate about depression in general, and my position, which is what really provoked the wrath of lots of people on the left and right, is that I don't think that depression and anxiety for anyone, that this counts as a mental illness. I don't think that that's a mental illness. I don't think it's a disease. I think that it is always, that anytime someone is depressed and you talk to them or they go to a counselor, you can trace the reason to something that's going on in their lives, and sometimes it may go back to, very often it's kind of obvious what's going on, and it could go back to their childhood. Many different factors play in.
Could go back to their understanding of their role in the world, and
right, exactly.
Spirit and religion.
If nothing else, it goes back to the fact that we are conscious beings living in the world, and I think that there's a certain amount of, we used to know that to live is to suffer, right? And so there's a certain amount of suffering that comes with simply being a conscious agent in the world, and so to chalk that up to a disease, I think, I'm accused of minimizing it because I say it's not a disease. I think it minimizes it to say that, it's just a chemical imbalance in the brain. Take a pill and you'll be fine. I think there's something much deeper and more serious going on. Doesn't mean that, just toughen up and get over it. It doesn't mean that depression doesn't exist. It doesn't mean we shouldn't help people that are suffering it. It just means that we should understand that it's much more complex and much deeper than simple chemicals.
But before we launch off, and Michael, I'll go to you next. To be clear, do you believe that there is such a thing as mental illness?
I mean, that's an interesting question. I'm actually a little bit, I was mentioning off the air, there's this guy named Thomas Szasz who wrote a book called The Myth of Mental Illness in the 1960s. And he was a psychiatrist, and his position was that the entire category of mental illness it's a category error. And in fact, We have brain diseases, which is like dementia, epilepsy, and you can look at what's happening in the brain, and it's very clear that the brain itself is diseased, and it's being destroyed by this disease. Mental illness is a separate thing. In fact, we call it a mental illness because its link to the brain is not exactly clear. And so what we're doing with mental illness is we're diagnosing behaviors. I mean, a good example, aside from depression, is ADHD. We see that a kid is being hyperactive, or he's not paying attention, he's bored in school or whatever. And we're deciding based on the behavior that there's something wrong in the mind, but the trace back to the physical brain is always quite unclear. And so his point is that mental illness is really sort of a metaphor for behaviors that we find abhorrent or inconvenient or distressing. And that what we've done is we've medicalized these behaviors when in fact there's an origin that's deeper than that, and it goes back to the conscious mind. And so I'm sympathetic to that view. I don't know if I totally buy into it, but when it comes to depression, anxiety, ADHD, I mean, I think that these things are essential to the human condition. Anxiety, this is something that philosophers, it used to be for thousands of years, who did we go to find out about a problem like anxiety or despair? We went to priests, we went to philosophers. Right. It was a philosophical question. And now we've decided that it's a medical question. And I don't think that things have gotten better because of that. I don't think anything's been clarified because of that.
Michael?
I'm very sympathetic to your take on this. But would you say that some people are born with, because it's a fallen world, or some people born with just some problems of their body or of their mind that make them perhaps a little more prone to melancholy, as we used to call it? Now we call it clinical depression or something. Sure. That make them a little more depressive or make them a little more eccentric. Or, I mean, it would seem to me that these sorts of things can be inborn, that they can have some biological basis. Sometimes you'll hear conservatives, they'll say, nobody is born gay, or nobody is born transgender. And I think, well, I mean, what do you know? Maybe I have no reason to think. I mean, it's a fallen world. Some people are born with 4 fingers. I mean, but
even if they're born that way, if you take ADHD, for example. So there are some kids who are born that way, and they're much more hyperactive than other kids. And maybe you can even trace it to the brain and see there's certain chemical reactions happening in the brain that make them more hyperactive. Well, the next question is, and this again I think is a philosophical question, how do you know the kid isn't supposed to be like that? I mean, you have decided that sort of personality isn't supposed to exist in the world, and therefore it's a medical problem. But that is a philosophical judgment. That is not a scientific judgment. And it's a judgment that we make, especially with ADHD, because we don't know how to deal with that. It's like when you go to a doctor and you say, my kid has ADHD, one of the first questions they ask you, the doctor, is it causing problems at school and at home? Now, if you go to the doctor and you say and he diagnoses you with liver cancer, he's not going to ask you whether it causes problems at home or at school because it's irrelevant. So I think that only shows, again, that this is sort of a judgment that we've made about these personality types.
But to be clear, there are differences in degree and also in kind. So schizophrenia is a mental condition, right? The problem with brain science is that it's extraordinarily underdeveloped, right? We actually know very, very little about how the brain works. MRIs and functional MRIs really haven't done very much to determine even what the various centers of the brain do at this point, other than like the most broad-based sort of assumptions. Schizophrenia is an actual mental condition that requires actual medication. Okay, when it comes to anxiety, there's a difference between experiencing mild anxiety and experiencing such severe anxiety that you can't get out of bed in the morning. And sometimes that can be situationally caused, and sometimes it absolutely is not situationally caused. And when it comes to things like OCD is an actual disorder in which you see people who are performing the same tasks over and over and over again. For example, like they'll sit there and they will write a word and then they'll erase the word, and then they'll write the word and then they'll erase the word, and they'll write the word and they'll erase the word. That is not something that is coming in the vast majority of cases from some sort of deep-seated societal trauma. That's coming from an actual problem in the wiring of the brain that requires both cognitive behavioral therapy as well as, in some cases, medication.
But there's a social phenomenon that I think, Matt, you're reacting to, which I react against as well, which is it's very popular now to say we need to destigmatize mental illness. And what that means on the surface is we shouldn't make people feel bad if they wake up clinically depressed. I was depressed once in my life because a family member died, and I got over it.
That's not depression.
That's sadness and despair. Now, some people wake up and nothing has gone wrong in their life and they're just depressed, and that's a different thing. So I'm not denying that. And so you're saying don't feel bad because you've got schizophrenia or bipolar or whatever. But I think the effect of destigmatized mental illness is now everyone takes to TikTok and brags about their mental illness, and it carries some social
We're
currency.
sort of dichotomous about this. So on the one hand, we say destigmatize mental illness, so that means let homeless people live on the streets and push people in front of subway
Right.
trains. And on the other hand, we say destigmatize mental illness such that there is no such thing as normal anymore, and so anybody's behavior has to be treated as normal even when it is completely abnormal. So I believe that there is normal. I believe that there are people who do require medication in order to reach some sort of stasis and
So what you're saying
in
is
their
that
life.
we and what I don't want to speak for you, but what I am saying is then in a certain way we need to re-stigmatize mental illness, not to make people feel bad, but to make people seek treatment for these behaviors that are destructive to themselves and society.
The problem is materialist bias in the medical community. I mean, having had the experience of actually having gone insane and having been saved, healed, I believe miraculously by talking to another human being. Never took any kind of drug at all, never, ever, anything. But I was healed. I was remarkably healed. I do believe that these psychotropic drugs are tools that can be used sometimes even by people whose lives, the narrative of their lives has caused them to be unhappy. Sometimes they're so unhappy that they can't get to the point where they can profit by therapy without a little bit of.
My
help from
grandfather's
drugs.
life was saved by lithium, right? He was
Exactly.
schizophrenic. His life was saved by lithium.
So there's no question that some people, as you point out, and I think this is a really important point, that some people are born with a chemical imbalance that can be fixed by chemicals. That's where we are wholly material creatures who represent spiritual truths. That's what we are. We are the language of spirit. Matter is the language of spirit. And so the problem is that once psychiatrists went from being talking cure people to being drug dealers, they gained incredibly in prestige.
Yeah.
The prestige of a psychiatrist now is huge because all that happens, you say, well, I'm divorced and I'm sad, here's a drug. That's what they do. That's literally what they do.
Right.
Not good ones.
What?
Not good ones.
Right.
Not
but,
good
but a
ones,
lot
yes,
of them. But a lot of them.
I don't want to lump all
85%
psychiatrists together.
No, but
because-
85% of them.
And they're going, their consequence, you look at the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, and at this point it's longer than the Bible. And
yes, and it's gotten
literally
more and more,
they have in fact medicalized and categorized every aspect of the human condition. And everyone sort of agrees with that. And anytime we have this conversation, people always say, oh yeah, these problems are overdiagnosed. Well, maybe we should stop and think, why is our mental illnesses so often overdiagnosed? We don't have that problem with diabetes. We don't have that problem with cancer. I mean, there may be false diagnosis, but it's not nearly the same. And so maybe that's because there's a problem with the way we perceive the category. So to your point about schizophrenia, for example, you can trace it to the brain. Well, the Thomas Zaz sort of way of looking at this, which again, I'm not saying I totally endorse, I just think it's an interesting idea. But he would say, well, okay, if you can totally trace it to the brain and it's clearly a disease, then it's a brain disease. And call it that. Don't call it a mental illness. So maybe that's the distinction we have to draw here because.
Whatever you call it, the treatment is the question.
Well,
right? You
I'm
can call it
not
whatever you
sure.
want, but
I'm
the
not
treatment
sure,
is the
Ben.
question.
What we call it matters. And yes, the treatment's the question, but or the treatment is a question, but I'm not sure that it's the question.
Yeah, that's right.
I think you really hit on something, the materialist bias of the medical community. And I think that that's where this thing lives. It's brain primacy, right? The meat primacy, material primacy. That's how we solve every question. But even the word mental implies the mind. What is the mind? The mind is the obvious intersection between our meat and what is transcendent about us. My mind is where I am, right? It's everything that I physically am, but it's all the things that I am that are not merely physical as well. The mind is the intersection of the body and the soul. The mind is the intersection of thought and feeling. The mind is where our actual identity actually lives, not the identities that we procure for ourselves through diagnoses. As such, the mind is not exclusively the brain.
Right.
The mind is not exclusively the material, and the mind cannot exclusively be treated through material means. But it is also the case that the mind is not exclusively spiritual. The mind is not exclusively transcendent, and therefore the mind can't exclusively be healed by exclusively transcendent means in every instance.
Well,
And so there are people who will say, pray the gay away, or people who say, pray your depression away. I'm not an advocate for that. There are also people who will say, oh, you've got a feeling, take a pill. Well, I'm not an advocate for that either. I think that we're in the most mysterious, least understood, and most essential part of what it means to be a person. And it is undoubtedly the case in a fallen world that as a child can be born with 4 fingers. A child can be born with a brain disorder. There are corruptions of the brain that can, left untreated, become corruption of the soul, because the mind is the sinew between those two ideas. It is also the case, though, that there are problems of the soul, problems of thought that can become, and this is the part that no scientist will ever talk about because it cuts against their entire materialist view. I can think thoughts that changed my physical brain over time. We know it's true, but we will not talk about it. Behaviors will change my brain over time, just like a lifting a weight will change the muscle in my arm.
Right.
Well, of course, that's the fundamental basis of the only form of psychiatry that actually has been shown to do anything aside from drugs, cognitive behavioral therapy.
That's right.
The entire basis of that is that you repeatedly breaking the chain of your own thoughts changes the pathways in your brain such that you have a different reaction.
This is why,
because,
I'm sorry.
because everything is in Shakespeare. You know, you read A Midsummer's Night's Dream, and he asks the question: if I give you a potion and you fall in love, are you in fact in love? And I think the question now is: if they give you a potion and you stop being depressed, are you in fact happy? And the best line about this came from a friend of mine who was given antidepressant drugs, and she said, "I'm still depressed. I just can't feel it anymore." And that is, to me, that was a very profound remark, because if you don't feel your depression, there are people who will say you are no longer depressed, but clearly that's not true. And just as if
I'm not sure I totally agree with all of this. The reason I'm not sure that I agree with all of this is because for a lot of people, clinical depression, for example, is an obstacle to happiness.
But you're talking,
so the question is
about practical. You're talking about practicality, and I'm talking about the reality.
Yeah, but there's another.
distinguish for me.
Well, for instance, I know people who have so badly raised their children that their children have mental problems, and they give their children drugs, and both the children and they are happier. But I don't think that has solved the problem.
Right.
I think it has erased the effects of it.
Well, I mean, I'm not saying that that's the
And sometimes
solution to
that's the only thing you can do.
Right, but the reality of the situation is that the best combination for some people, and again, I think that the reason people are getting uptight about this is because the suggestion when it comes to the notion that this is mostly a spiritual problem that can be solved through mostly spiritual means is that the responsibility for your own happiness lies with you. In many cases, that's true. I mean, I think we all agree that in many cases that's true, that the only thing that can change your circumstances is your outlook on the world, right? There's been a religious perspective since religion began, right? Or that the only way that you can change your approach to the world is through changing the way that you act toward the world. All of that may be true. And then for a lot of people, there may be another problem. And that problem was not caused by an outside stimulus, or if it was caused by an outside stimulus, it cannot be removed anymore by changing the outside stimulus.
These
These are not mutually exclusive.
That's
things.
right.
What I'm saying about depression, I don't think it's a mental illness or disease. That doesn't necessarily preclude the option of taking a drug to help address it. I'm skeptical of a lot of these drugs, and I think that they're way overused.
I agree there.
But there's no reason, just because if you were to subscribe to my idea that it's not a disease, that doesn't necessarily mean that you can't take a drug to address it. There's also there's a chicken or egg problem here, which I think Jeremy alluded to, which is even if we could trace depression back to a chemical imbalance in the brain, which by the way is a totally outdated theory, and almost any scientist you talk to now or doctor who's being honest will tell you that's at best a massive oversimplification. But even if you could find a quote chemical imbalance in the brain of a depressed person, well, the question is, are they depressed because of the chemical imbalance, or is the chemical imbalance there because they're depressed? And what I would say is that we talk about the mind. I mean, what's the mind? The mind is your conscious experience of the world, okay? And your brain is the organ in your head. So this idea that we can really simply and kind of blithely medicalize someone's conscious experience of the world and say, well, your experience is incorrect, and so it's and not only is it incorrect, but it's diseased, it's sick.
I actually do have a fundamental disagreement with this. I think that there are certain circumstances where you can look at a person and you realize there's a reason why the person is depressed. So, for example, you had a friend or family member who died, and now you're down. Right, that we can tell that is not a medicalization of your problem. You had a stimulus. You have responded to the stimulus in what we would consider a normal way. If you had gotten suicidal over that person, that would assume that there was probably some underlying problem with you that has now been triggered by this existential stimulus.
But that problem could be, yes, I agree, it could be some problem in my brain.
In other words, I'm saying that I don't think that it's a fully subjective matter. There has to be some sort of outside analysis of whether the reaction to a particular stimulus or to your surrounding circumstances.
The problem is hopelessness. The problem is a suicidal person. We're talking about, and that's why I use depression and despair interchangeably, because despair is the
loss of hope.
It is the worst thing a person can internally experience is despair, which is why it's sort of strange to me people got upset when I compare depression to despair. despair is the worst possible thing. I'm not
Despair
minimizing
is
hope.
worse than depression.
Right.
Yeah,
Despair is a total loss of hope. So someone who's suicidal, they have no hope and they see no meaning in their lives, and that's why they're suicidal. Now, that's not good. We should not accept it. We should do everything we can to try to help them. But the question is a lack of hope a medical problem? You know, and
Is there a good reason for the lack of hope or no?
well,
Not in my.
I mean, really. I mean, this is a serious question. It's a serious question.
but it's-
If your entire family is, if you're Job and your entire family is struck down, and then you are hopeless, that's not a medical problem. If, however, you wake up in the morning, you have a good job, you're married, and you have 2 kids, and you wake up hopeless, that's probably a medical problem.
that's a philosophical question.
Probably a medical problem.
No,
No,
but providentially, I was reading Job today. And it was kind of, this is the way the world works, I guess. And there is this issue. Job remains faithful to God, right? At least, you know, most of the book, he's quite cheery in the face of his entire family being wiped out and everything he loves going away. If someone loses a loved one and they get down and they're sad and they're despairing and then they become suicidal, it might be because there's some problem in their brain. It might be because their view of the world is that life is a tale told by an idiot full of sound and fury signifying nothing. And that is not a chemical problem, though there might be some chemical effect of it. That's a philosophical problem. It's a theological problem. It's a
I believe that I believe that I had.
will have a chemical.
I
Of
believe
course.
that I went through mental illness for a moment at age 38. And I'm using that word loosely, but also acutely. The worst thing I've ever gone through, I had a thought in my mind, and I could not separate myself from the thought or of the consequences of the thought. The thought dominated everything. It was only a thought. It was only a thought. It was a thought that risked burning my marriage to the ground. It's a thought that, left unchecked, could have burned my life to the ground, could have burned this business to the ground. It was only a thought, but it was also chemicals in my brain. I could feel, like when you were a teenager and you start having hormones for the first time, I could feel the wave of the chemical when it would come over me in response to the thought, and like a wash that would wash across my brain and change how I saw the world from that moment forward. Now, all mental illnesses are not the same. It was not schizophrenia. It was not. I don't want to be overly simplistic in how we talk about these things. I am using the language mental illness. You may be right that that's a bad use of language. But whatever we're talking about, we know that they're a different thing. We're talking about a wide range of possible phenomena.
And by the way, just on this point, I mean, you compare it to a teenager, let's say a teenager experiences love for the first time, and he says, "Oh, I have heartache." He's describing an actual physical phenomenon going on.
And this was a physical phenomenon as much as anything, but it was also just a thought. And I believe that I was miraculously healed as well from that thought, which had power over me. And this is where the spiritual question, which is more important to me than the diagnostic question, it is more important to me even than the treatment question. It's the underlying spiritual question. And in the underlying spiritual question, there is a belief in Christianity about being born into sin. That Adam was made in the image of God according to Genesis, but according to Genesis 5, Seth was born in the image of Adam, and that man born in the image of Adam has carried with him not even the possibility. No act of free will could result in a righteous life. Righteousness is not attainable in the Christian view by a man. By saying that, we are acknowledging that something can exist that we cannot overcome. That something that you do not sin just because you want to sin. Paul says, the things I don't want to do, I do all the times. The thing that I want to do, I scarcely ever do. That implies that there is a limit to what free will is, that we cannot think our way into perfect health. If sin is the root cause of all corruption, and therefore not your sin is the reason you have cancer, but sin is the reason there's cancer. That's an important distinction. I'm not saying you have a mental illness because of your sin, but mental illness is the result of sin in this way of thinking writ large across humanity, right? So there is corruption. There are kids born with 4 fingers. There are kids born with a hole in their heart. There are kids born addicted to drugs. They never chose to do drugs. They're born addicted to drugs. There are undoubtedly kids who are born with, at a minimum, not solving all the answers of the cosmos here, with a proclivity toward depression, proclivity toward homosexuality. Are kids born gay? I don't know. But there are certainly kids for whom that struggle is different than, and there are people who have sex with other men in prison or on ships, and that was not in any way biological. Well, it's biological, but it's not. It's not that form of biological.
Mostly convenient. Yeah, right.
All of this range of messiness exists in the human condition. And so when we talk about the spiritual underpinning of this thing, I'm not suggesting that it is exclusively a spiritual problem that can be exclusively solved by spiritual means. I don't think even, Matt, that you're saying that. I'm not saying that every problem is a thought that you can think your way out of. I am saying, though, that because the mind lives between the spirit and the brain, the corruption can flow both directions. And sometimes something that may have started as a thought may have moved over into corruption in my brain. And I may even need brain treatment to even help myself get out from my last thing. I might need brain treatment in the form of a drug to even help right me enough to even be able to deal with these thoughts and get back to this other problem, or vice versa.
Maybe at every level. It may be at every level. It depends on what perspective you have. From God's perspective, it all may be demons taking you over. You know, from our perspective, obviously, the tools that we have are drugs and physicality and all this. These things. You know, I often wonder with schizophrenics who hear like a demon in their mind telling them to do something awful. I often wonder, like, maybe maybe they should be drugged to get rid of their schizophrenia. But maybe their schizophrenia is allowing
there are demons, right? There are angels.
You've made the point before. No one ever hears voices telling them
to do something.
Good job, buddy.
I think, and I agree with you that it's not exclusively spiritual, but I do think it's fundamentally spiritual, because to go to Ben's question before about, you know, we're talking about someone who's hopeless and they're suicidal, and you said, you asked, well, is there a reason for him to be hopeless? And my answer to that is no, there's no reason for anyone to be hopeless. But that is a fundamentally religious answer that I'm giving, and and there's no way to separate that, because you could have a philosophical view of life which is fundamentally hopeless, and there are many philosophers who have argued that basically there's no hope, there's no meaning to life. I think that's incorrect. I think it's damaging. I think it's horrible. I think it's ugly. I think that people that suffer from that, we have to help them. But it's not medical. That's not a medical.
But I do think that there are distinctions even here between questions that we ask that are within the realm of rationality and ones that we ask that are not. If somebody is suicidal because they didn't get enough peas in their alphabet soup, that's fundamentally different from somebody is deciding that they're suicidal because life is meaningless and there's no hope in the universe.
I would push back. I'm going to push back and then pull. My push is, at the end of the day, my guess is that the person who feels suicidal because of the peas also has a thought problem. It may not be the thought of loss like Job's thought. It may be a thought of narcissism. It may be a false expectation of what the world can provide. There are thoughts related to that are wrong. But here's my pull. My pull is also that there is likely something that we can measure in their brain and treat medically that may also be wrong. And this is why I say...
That's right, because I'm not a cartoon
that's always
dualist.
true.
That's true if your wife leaves you, too.
Right,
Yeah.
That's right. But this is the ultimate thing that I'm driving at, which is to say, I agree with Matt that it is fundamentally a spiritual question, in the way that all questions are fundamentally spiritual questions. But that doesn't mean in a very practical sense that our only tools are spiritual tools.
Totally
because
That's right.
just like I say the things I don't, Paul says the things I don't want to do, I do. The answer isn't try harder. That isn't even the spiritual answer, is not try harder. Sometimes as conservatives, we speak in certain kinds of absolutes, and I think they're the correct absolutes to order a society. Free will, as a concept to order society around, is a far better concept than determinism to order a society around. But free will...
Which is impossible.
But free will isn't a complete answer. It's a framework with which we can build around. Reality is often messier. Even a spiritual problem that, as I said, cancer is the result of sin, that doesn't mean your cancer is the result of your sin. We live in this corrupted world. And in this corrupted world, we sometimes bear consequences for things that we didn't do. Again, the child born addicted to drugs did nothing. They are still addicted to drugs. The answer to their addiction isn't the same as the answer to your teenage buddy who's starting to experiment with drugs. Your answer to him is going to be a very whip-cracking, cut that crap out answer. That's no answer to a baby who's
But I would say that the problem of the two people is fundamentally different, right? The child's not experiencing a spiritual problem. The child's experiencing a physical problem.
Well, I'm saying in the final analysis, the child is dealing with a spiritual problem, but not a individual spiritual
right.
problem.
Okay, so this is
not
a
an individual
big
spiritual
distinction.
Nice
Okay,
if
so
we
this is a big
had
distinction.
psychiatrists
I think
who
this
ask
is
these questions, though.
well, no.
Yeah,
This is a fundamental distinction that I think we ought to keep in mind. So if you go all the way back to Emile Durkheim, who was the first sort of person to write very seriously about suicide, right? Writing in the 1870s, he wrote a book called On Suicide, in which he looked at comparative suicide statistics across countries and across cultures. And he talked about why it was that he thought that there were certain cultures that were more prone to suicide and why certain cultures were less prone to suicide and all of this. All of that is well worth discussing because there are certain societies that are just sicker than others. Right? There are certain societies that just have more social problems than others, that breed a spiritual malaise. There's no question that that's true. It is also true that to try and apply that to an individual inherently, to say that every individual who is suffering from depression is doing so because of this suicidal thing, because of this broader social problem,
That's right.
it's almost like the mistake that people make by saying that, you bad things happen to bad people. So that therefore, if something bad happened to you, it's because you did a bad thing.
That's right.
Right. Like there's a fundamental religious belief that
The rain falls on the just and the unjust alike.
Right. But there is a fundamental spiritual belief that on a general level, if you do good things, your life will be better for it. But we all know people for whom that's not true. Yeah. Okay. And that means that when you look at the individual, you can't say to that individual, the reason your life sucks is because you made bad decisions. Maybe that's not true. Okay. The same thing to me is true when we get to things like mental illnesses and depression and disorders. Yes, it is true that our society has bred depression. There's no question. We've gotten rid of fundamental societal institutions. This breeds depression. We have known about this again for 150 years. This is nothing new. I mean, Durkheim called it the problem of anomie, the idea that spelled anomie. The idea was that people are reliant on the fundamental institutions around them. When there's sea changes to those institutions, people fall into despair and confusion, and they can't recapitulate. They can't sort of find their center again. Yeah. Right? This has been happening throughout society, particularly in the West, for 150 years. With that said, I think the reason that you drove a lot of outrage is because what people did is then they applied it to the individual. Right? They made the mistake that religious people sometimes make of saying, well, the bad thing happened to you, that's because it's a social problem that you have failed to somehow grasp with. And for a lot of people, that's not true. For a lot of people, you can say that society has a sickness, and you can also say that the individual has OCD, or the individual has generalized anxiety disorder. And sometimes that may be because of some sort of outside problem, and that can be cured by fixing the outside problem, such as taking the masks off your kids and letting them go to school and leave them the hell alone. And sometimes the kid just has OCD. Sometimes the kid just has general anxiety disorder.
Sometimes the material corrupts the spiritual. And sometimes the spiritual corrupts the...
It would be nice if we had psychiatrists who looked at people as whole things instead of as
meat puppets.
Yeah, meat.
The consequence of this is that, talk about the outrage that came my way, is that we're dealing with these really big, complicated problems like despair, suffering, the human mind, and we can't even talk about these problems anymore. Like, the conversation in our society is over about human suffering and consciousness and despair because we've decided that it's medicalized and there's no room to even discuss it anymore.
And because of identity. Because when you make your identity something other than God,
yes,
you now can't wrestle with those ideas anymore without it being an absolute attack on your actual.
It's also because what people are doing is they're doing the mistake that I talked about earlier in reverse, right? So if the idea is on the religious level that good things happen to good people, bad things happen to bad people, but there are exceptions, then the reverse is for a lot of people. If I'm suffering from depression and it's not my fault, therefore all depression in society is nobody's fault. Right, and that's also a mistake, right? There's a mistake of individualizing the general, and there's a mistake of generalizing the individual.
That's right.
Yeah.